Anatta and Nibbana. Egolessness and Deliverance. By Nyanaponika Thera. Buddhist Publication Society. Kandy Sri Lanka. The Wheel Publication Number 11. First published, 1959. Reprinted, 1971, 1986. A slightly differing German version of this essay appeared in 1951 in the magazine Die Einsicht. The English version was first published in the quarterly The Light of the Dhamma, Volume 4, Number 3. Rangoon 1957, under the title Nibbana in the Light of the Middle Doctrine. BPS Online Edition. Copyright, 2008. Digital transcription source, BPS Transcription Project. For free distribution. This work may be republished, reformatted, reprinted, and redistributed in any medium. However, any such republication and redistribution is to be made available to the public on a free and unrestricted basis. And translations and other derivative works are to be clearly marked as such, and the BPS is to be acknowledged as the original publisher. Introduction. This world, Kakana, usually leans upon a duality, upon the belief in existence or non-existence. Avoiding these two extremes, the perfect one shows the doctrine in the middle. Dependent on ignorance are the karma formations. By the cessation of ignorance, karma formations cease. SN 1215. The above saying of the Buddha speaks of the duality of existence, atheta, and non-existence, natheta. These two terms refer to the theories of eternalism, sasatadithi, and annihilationism, ukitadithi. The basic misconceptions of actuality that in various forms repeatedly reappear in the history of human thought. Eternalism is the belief in a permanent substance or entity, whether conceived as a multitude of individual souls or selves, created or not, as a monistic world soul, a deity of any description, or a combination of any of these notions. Annihilationism, on the other hand, asserts the temporary existence of separate selves or personalities, which are entirely destroyed or dissolved after death. Accordingly, the two key words of the text quoted above refer 1. To the absolute, i.e., eternal, existence of any assumed substance or entity, and 2. To the ultimate, absolute annihilation of separate entities conceived as impermanent, i.e., their non-existence after the end of their lifespan. These two extreme views stand and fall with the assumption of something static of either permanent or impermanent nature. They will lose their basis entirely if life is seen in its true nature, as a continuous flux of material and mental processes arising from their appropriate conditions, a process which will cease only when these conditions are removed. This will explain why our text introduces here the formula of dependent origination, paticca samuppada, and its reversal, dependent cessation. Dependent origination, being an unbroken process, excludes the assumption of an absolute non-existence, or not, terminating individual existence. The qualifying term dependent indicates that there is also no absolute, independent existence, no static being per se, but only an evanescent arising of phenomena dependent on likewise evanescent conditions. Dependent cessation excludes the belief in absolute and permanent existence. It shows, as well, that there is no automatic lapse into non-existence. For the cessation of relative existence too is a conditioned occurrence. Thus these teachings of dependent origination and dependent cessation are a true doctrine in the middle, transcending the extremes of existence and non-existence. Thinking by way of such conceptual contrasts as existence and non-existence has, however, a powerful hold on man. The hold is so powerful because this way of thinking is perpetually nourished by several strong roots deeply embedded in the human mind. The strongest of them is the practical and theoretical assumption of an ego or self. It is the powerful wish for a preservation and perpetuation of the personality, or a refined version of it, that lies behind all the numerous varieties of eternalistic belief. But even with people who have discarded eternalistic creeds or theories, the instinctive belief in the uniqueness and importance of their particular personalities is still so strong that they take death, the end of the personality, to mean complete annihilation or non-existence. Thus the belief in a self is responsible not only for eternalism, but also for the annihilationist view. Either in its popular unphilosophical form which regards death as the utter end, or in materialistic theories elaborating the same position. There are other contributory roots of these notions of existence and non-existence closely connected with the main root of ego belief. There is, for instance, a linguistic root, consisting in the basic structure of language, subject and predicate, noun and adjective, and its tendency to simplify affirmative and negative statements for the sake of easy communication and orientation. The structural features of language and linguistic habits of simplified statements have exercised a subtle but strong influence on our way of thinking, making us inclined to assume that there must be a thing if there is a word for it. These one-sided views may also spring from emotional reasons, expressive of basic attitudes to life. They may reflect the moods of optimism and pessimism, hope and despair, the wish to feel secure through metaphysical support, or the desire to live without inhibitions in a materialistically conceived universe. The theoretical views of eternalism or annihilationism held by an individual may well change during his lifetime, together with the corresponding moods or emotional needs. There is also an intellectual root, the speculative and theorizing propensity of the mind. Certain thinkers, people of the theorizing type, Dithakarita, in Buddhist psychology, are prone to create various elaborate philosophical systems in which, with great ingenuity, they play off against each other the pairs of conceptual opposites. The great satisfaction this gives to those engaged in such thought constructions further reinforces the adherence to them. From these brief remarks, one will be able to appreciate the strength and variety of the forces which induce man to think, feel, and speak in the way of these opposites. Absolute existence or absolute non-existence. Thus the Buddha had good reason for saying, in our introductory passage, that people usually lean upon a duality. We need not be surprised that even Nibbana, the Buddhist goal of deliverance, has been wrongly interpreted in the sense of these extremes. But rigid concepts of existence and non-existence cannot do justice to the dynamic nature of actuality. Still less do they apply to Nibbana, which the Buddha declared to be supramundane, lokuttara, and beyond conceptual thinking, atakavakara. In the early days, when knowledge of Buddhist teachings had just reached the West, most writers and scholars, with a few exceptions like Schopenhauer and Max Muller, took Nibbana to be pure and simple non-existence. Consequently, Western writers too readily described Buddhism as a nihilistic doctrine teaching annihilation as its highest goal, a view these writers condemned as philosophically absurd and ethically reprehensible. Similar statements still sometimes appear in prejudiced non-Buddhist literature. The pendular reaction to that view was the conception of Nibbana as existence. It was now interpreted in the light of already familiar religious and philosophical notions as pure being, pure consciousness, pure self, or some other metaphysical concept. But even Buddhist thought could not always keep clear of a lopsided interpretation of Nibbana. This happened even in early times. The sect of the Sautrantikas had a rather negativistic view of Nibbana, while the Mahayanistic conceptions of Buddha fields, Buddhakshtra, primordial, Adi, Buddha, Tathagatagarbha, etc., favored a positive metaphysical interpretation. It is, therefore, not surprising that modern Buddhist writers also sometimes advocate these extremes. In Buddhist countries of the East, however, there is now not a single Buddhist school or sect known to the writer that favors a nihilistic interpretation of Nibbana. Contrary to erroneous opinions, voiced mainly by uninformed or prejudiced Western authors, Theravada Buddhism is definitely averse to the view that Nibbana is mere extinction. This statement will be substantiated in the first main section of this essay. For reasons mentioned earlier, it is not always easy to steer clear of those two opposite views of existence and non-existence, and to keep closely to the middle path shown by the Buddha, the teaching of dependent origination and dependent cessation. Until that way of thinking in terms of conditionality has been fully absorbed into the mind, constant watchfulness will be required to avoid slipping unaware into either eternalism or annihilationism, or coming too close to them. When discussing these questions, there is the danger one will be carried away by one's own arguments and counter one extreme by endorsing its opposite. Therefore, in the treatment of that problem, great caution and self-criticism is required lest one lose sight of the middle path. The primary purpose of this treatise is to offer material for clearly demarcating the Buddha's doctrine of Nibbana from both misinterpretations. Its intention is not to encourage speculations on the nature of Nibbana, which are bound to be futile and may even be detrimental to the endeavor to attain it. The canonical texts elucidating the Four Noble Truths say that Nibbana, the third truth, is to be realized, sakakatabam, it is not to be understood, like the first truth, nor to be developed, like the fourth truth. We must also emphasize that the material presented here should not be used in a one-sided manner as an argument in favor of either extreme against the other. Each of the two main sections of this treatise requires the other for its qualification and completion. It is hoped that the material from canonical and commentarial sources collected in these pages, by clarifying the position of Theravada, will at least reduce the points of conflict between the opposing interpretations. The nihilistic negative extreme. Section 1. We shall first consider the basic work of post-canonical Theravada literature, the Path of Purification, Visuddhimagga, compiled in the 5th century AC by the great commentator Bhattacharya Buddhaghosa. This monumental work furnishes a comprehensive and systematic exposition of the principal Buddhist doctrines. It is derived from the Pali Canon and the ancient commentarial literature, which partly incorporates material that may well go back to the earliest times of the teaching. In this work, in Chapter 16 on the faculties and truths, in the section dealing with the third noble truth, we find a lengthy disquisition on Nibbana. It is striking that the polemic part of it is exclusively directed against what we have called the nihilistic negative extreme in the interpretation of Nibbana. We cannot be sure about the reason for that limitation, since no explicit statement is given. It is, however, possible that the Venerable Buddhaghosa, or perhaps the traditional material he used, was keen that the Theravada teachings on that subject should be well distinguished from those of a prominent contemporary sect, the Sautrantikas, which in other respects was close to the general standpoint of Theravada. The Sautrantikas belonged to that group of schools which we suggest should be called Savakayana, following the early Mahayanist nomenclature, instead of the derogatory Hinayana. The Theravadins obviously did not want to be included in the accusation of nihilism which the Mahayanists raised against the Sautrantikas. This might have been the external reason for the Visuddhimagga's emphasis on the rejection of the nihilistic conception of Nibbana. As to the positive metaphysical view, the Venerable Buddhaghosa perhaps thought it sufficiently covered by the numerous passages in the Visuddhimagga dealing with the rejection of the eternity view and of a transcendental self. However that may be, even nowadays Buddhism, and Theravada in particular, is quite often wrongly accused of nihilism. It is therefore apposite to summarize here the arguments found in the Visuddhimagga, followed, in section 2, by additions from the commentary to that work. 1. Many passages from the suttas relevant to a rejection of nihilism are quoted in both these extracts, making it unnecessary to deal with them separately. In the aforementioned chapter of the Visuddhimagga, the argument proper is preceded by a definition of Nibbana. The definition uses three categories usually employed in commentarial literature for the purpose of elucidation. Nibbana has peace as its characteristic. Its function is not to die, or its function is to comfort. It is manifested as the signless without the signs, or marks, of greed, hatred, and delusion, or it is manifested as non-diversification. In the argument proper, the Venerable Buddhaghosa first rejects the view that Nibbana is non-existent, holding it must exist as it can be realized by practicing the path. The adversary, however, while admitting that Nibbana is not non-existent, still insists on a negative understanding of the nature of Nibbana. He argues first that Nibbana should be understood simply as the absence of all the factors of existence, i.e., the five aggregates. Buddhaghosa counters this by replying that Nibbana can be attained during an individual's lifetime, while his aggregates are still present. The adversary then proposes that Nibbana consists solely in the destruction of all defilements, quoting in support of his contention the Sutta passage. That, friend, which is the destruction of greed, hate and delusion that is Nibbana, SN 38:1. Buddhaghosa rejects this view too, pointing out that it leads to certain undesirable consequences. It would make Nibbana temporal, since the destruction of the defilements is an event that occurs in time, and it makes Nibbana conditioned. Since the actual destruction of the defilements occurs through conditions. He points out that Nibbana is called the destruction of greed, hate and delusion in a metaphorical sense. Because the unconditioned reality, Nibbana, is the basis or support for the complete destruction of those defilements. Venerable Buddhaghosa next deals with the negative terminology the Buddha uses to describe Nibbana. He explains that such terminology is used because of Nibbana's extreme subtlety. The opponent argues that since Nibbana is attained by following the path, it cannot be uncreated. Buddhaghosa answers that Nibbana is only reached by the path, but not produced by it. Thus it is uncreated, without beginning, and free from aging and death. He then goes on to discuss the nature of Nibbana more explicitly. The Buddha's goal is one and has no plurality. But this single goal, Nibbana, is firstly called with result of past clinging left. Upadissa, since it is made known together with the aggregates resulting from past clinging still remaining during the Arahat's life. Being thus made known in terms of the stilling of defilements and the remaining result of past clinging that are present in one who has reached it by means of development. But secondly, it is called without result of past clinging left, anupadissa, since after the last consciousness of the Arahat, who has abandoned arousing future aggregates, and so prevented karma from giving result in a future existence, there is no further arising of aggregates of existence, and those already arisen have disappeared. So the result of past clinging that remained is non-existent. And it is in terms of this non-existence, in the sense that there is no result of past clinging here, that